You straggled in since I last looked. That's good. It's always nice to see some smiling faces smile back at you. I remember well the year. It was 1976. Some of you weren't even born then. I was 11 in 1976. I grew up in a churched home. My parents and grandparents went to church every Sunday. It wasn't something that you thought about or you even had a choice in the matter. When Sunday came, you got up and you went to church. It's just what you did. I grew up in a family that my grandfather wouldn't even let you fish on Sunday. It just was not what you didn't do. And my dad didn't go out to eat on Sunday and still doesn't like to. But I grew up in a home that of parents and grandparents who loved Jesus, who devoted their lives to serving Him, were active leaders in the church. And in 1976, at church camp, that summer, not too far from here. In fact, it's our church camp. It's amazing that I've come full circle. I went to seminary in Chicago, pastored some churches in Pennsylvania. Now I'm here an hour from where I grew up and an hour from this church camp I'm talking about, Camp Mardella, where our kids from this congregation go. And speaking of that, the registration forms are out. They're in the back. So if you are interested in summer camp, you can do that. At Camp Mardella in 1976, Reverend Robert Alley was the leader of that camp, which I find fascinating because years later, when I was a pastor in training, our paths crossed again, and we served. Sharon served 2 summer pastorates in the church that he was pastor of, and I was there one summer, the second summer with her after we were married. But Robert Alley was the leader at that camp in Camp Mardella in 1976 when I was 11. And at that time, I knew about Jesus. I had heard my parents and grandparents talk about Jesus. I'd heard the pastor of my congregation, and that pastor was my pastor for 40 years, the only pastor I knew growing up. I heard him talk about Jesus. I heard him talk about the love they had for Jesus. And that summer, Reverend Alley talked about him in such a way that caused me to think a little differently than I had been thinking as an 11-year-old about Jesus. Nothing particularly happened at camp except my eyes were open and I began asking some questions and wrestling and thinking through who Jesus was and what was my relationship to Jesus and what was it going to be? It's interesting that fall of 1976, after the summer, a few months later, Reverend Robert Alley was the revival speaker at my home church in Cordova, Maryland. And I remember it well, just like I remember a lot of things that happened in my life, and better than I remember some things that happened in my life. It was near the end of the week of revivals, and the organist and pianist were playing "Come Just As I Am, I Come." And Reverend Alley had issued an invitation for anyone who wanted to stake a claim that night, to drive a stake in the ground, to say that Jesus was their Lord, their leader, their forgiver, their Savior. And I felt something come over me and carry me up the aisle. And I was baptized later that fall. I remember well that experience. And that experience has forever changed my life. That day long ago, I drove a stake in the ground as I declared my love for Jesus and my desire to follow Him in all of my life. I had no idea then as an 11-year-old what that meant, or what it would mean, or where I would go, or what I would do. But I'm here today to tell you that since that day, my life has never been the same. The places I've gone, the things I've done, the experiences I've had, I can't even begin to tell you what my life would have been like had I not made that claim. And I don't even want to think about it. Had I not made the choice to give my life to Christ and to serve Him with all that I am and all that I have. That decision changed my life for the better. Had I not made that decision that day, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you today. I can guarantee you. Well, who knows? But most likely I wouldn't have. Had I not made that decision that day, I wouldn't have married Sharon. Because you see, I met her the very first day that I arrived on the seminary campus of Bethany Theological Seminary in Oak Brook, Illinois, near Chicago. I remember that day well, too. I was parked next to her car, and she was getting out carrying groceries in as I was just arriving after a 16-hour drive with all of my belongings in my car, my little Ford Escort. Sharon had been warned about me, and she knew that I was coming. She had been told about me by some friends I had just met. I knew their grandmother well in Ridgely, Maryland, and they were in visiting her before they went to seminary, and I met them, and they arrived before I did, and Sharon arrived before I did, and they talked about me. And so Sharon had some idea of who I was, and I had no idea who she was. And had I not made that decision that day in 1976 to stake a claim on who Jesus is, those two girls right there in the second row wouldn't be here either, Caroline and Emma. I might have had a daughter named Caroline, but it wouldn't be this daughter. Or I might have had a daughter named Emma. I probably wouldn't have, because Emma is Sharon's grandmother's name. Caroline is my grandmother's name. Making that decision in 1976 to love, follow, and serve Jesus was the best decision I ever made in my life. And I've made some good decisions, and I've made some not so good decisions, but it was by far the best decision I ever made in my life. Well, in our passage today that Pastor Sharon already read, Jesus asks His disciples a couple of very important questions. First, He asks them, "Who do people say I am?" And that's an interesting question. Who do people say I am? I mean, I had heard about Jesus all my life. I grew up in a family that talked about Jesus regularly. And I could tell you who my grandparents or who my parents or who my uncles and aunts thought Jesus was, who my pastor thought Jesus was. But until Robert Alley came to Camp Mardella, I hadn't given a whole lot of thought who I thought Jesus was. And it's interesting that Jesus starts there. Who do people say I am? Because that's where it starts for all of us. Our relationship with Jesus always starts with who someone else tells us He is, whether it's reading about Him in the Scriptures, whether it's Tina telling me who He is, or Stacy telling me about Him, or my mom and dad, or my grandparents, or a friend, a companion, somebody that's joined me in the journey of life. All of our journeys with Jesus start with someone else telling us or showing us who He is. And so it's no surprise that Jesus starts there, but He doesn't stop there. Most importantly, He then asks them, "Who do you say I am?" In that question, He's asking them to drive a stake, to make a decision, to decide and to declare who He is in their lives. And this, my brothers and sisters, in my humble opinion, is the most important question you will ever answer in your life. Who is Jesus to you? There's no greater question, no more important question than you could answer ever. Who is Jesus to you? And your answer to this question will profoundly change the trajectory of your life. Since answering that question in 1976, and I don't even know how long ago that was. Well, it was 41 years ago, because I'll be 52 in May. My math right? Yeah, 11 and and 42 is 50, or 11 and 41 is 52, right? Since answering that question in 1976 for me, my life has never been the same. In college, I thought I was going to be an accountant. I was studying. I was in a business administration degree line, and my major was out of accounting, and I thought I was going to be an accountant. My second year in college, I felt very strongly the call to enter into the ministry. And that was like wild, because that was not even, that wasn't even on my list. It didn't even make the top 10. It didn't even make the top 100 of things that I might do with my life, because I never thought about it. And all of a sudden, people were saying to me, you should be a minister. You should be a minister. We see gifts in you. And I'm like, really? Come on. And so my home church pastor allowed me the opportunity to preach. And people were saying it then. And so I thought, you know what, God, if this is it, and I drove a stake in the ground, and I staked a claim on who Jesus is in my life. And if he indeed is my leader and Lord, I'm going to follow him. I'm going to go where the doors open and follow. And when they close, I'll know that that's not the direction for me. And so I prayed about it, and I sent an application to Bethany Theological Seminary, and they accepted me. And so after I graduated in 1987 with a degree in business administration, majored in accounting, I went off to Bethany Theological Seminary in Chicago, and decided I was going to test this calling. And I did. And I met Sharon the first day I was there. We married the second year that we were there. We sat back to back on our honeymoon writing our Midler thesis. Then we served I served two churches as summer pastor. One we served together, and then together we've served three churches as co-pastors, landing here in 1999, 18 years ago, as your pastors at Community of Joy, then Community Church of the Brethren. And my life has been so enriched by that decision to stake a claim on Jesus and to follow his lead in my life. My life has been so enriched by the constant companionship of Jesus with me on the journey, on all the ups and on the downs. My life has been so enriched by the people that I've met and served alongside of. You guys have enriched my life immensely. What incredible followers of Jesus you are. The impact that you are having on this community for the kingdom of God is immeasurable. The lives that you're touching with the love of Jesus are countless. They're far greater than the size of this church. Yesterday, just in this last week, I want to recount some of the ways that we've touched lives. Yesterday at God's Kitchen, 125 people were fed by your hands, by your generosity, with your love. That wasn't yesterday, but that's the only picture I had in my files. I wasn't there. You all were there serving 125 people, and I was out in the garden working with 3, 2 kids and an adult. But it was beautiful that we fed these people that came in off the streets that had need to be fed. Last night, as we did the silent auction for our youth, we exposed a whole group of people in our community to the awesome youth group and youth leaders that we have in this congregation. $2,278 were raised last night for our youth, because they want to serve. They want to go places. They want to share the love of Jesus widely and wildly. And we're excited about that. This week at Pinehurst Elementary School, Bob and I, and Bob's not here this morning, but we went around and handed out packets of appreciation to each of the teachers. I think we handed out 45 packets. And that's the content of one of the packets. And you'll notice there's the hand sanitizer, and then there's a handmade and handwritten note that we did at one of our Be a Blessing Sundays back in January. And then there's erasers and pencils and dry erase markers and Kleenexes, and that's what was in the packet. And I didn't notice this until this morning, but if you look down on the right-hand corner on the planner, it says COJ lunch provided on the 20th. And I don't know if that's taken off of a teacher's Facebook page. She posted that in appreciation and tagged me in it. And thank you for that gift. And I hadn't noticed that, but they are so appreciative of that. And as Bob and I went around, we heard teachers say, one teacher proclaimed loudly, "This is like gold." And all it was pencils and tissues and dry erase markers and Germ-X. But it's all things that teachers have to provide for themselves. And so we gave them that. And then we discovered that there were 2 Mrs. Shockleys on staff, and we only had a bag for one Mrs. Shockley. And we went to the wrong Mrs. Shockley, and I know that that's the wrong one because we gave them to the teacher and the administrative, the other staff that are in the classroom. We only gave one bag to each class. And so the Mrs. Shockley we first went to didn't have associates in her class. The one we had on the handwritten note was to the Mrs. Shockley that had 2 other assistants in her class. And so she said, I'm not her. There's another one. And so as God would provide, we had one more of those notes that you made that had not been filled out that Sharon was going to use for the scrapbook that she was making me. So she wrote it out, and I went to the closet in our home and got out a box of tissues. And other than that, we had everything else that was in the bag except the markers. We had a packet of 8, not a packet of 5. And so I thought she needs to get more than the rest of them because she gets hers a day later. So I put it in a bag and I went and gave it to her the next day. And you'd have thought I had given her $1 million. She was so touched that we had forgotten her, and then we came back, that we didn't let her out. And that's how we roll here. And then last Sunday, I told you the story of Pete Layfield, who is the next picture. Pete created the compost and gave it to us at a huge discount. And I told you that in the early service, as I was sharing the tales of Pete's journey for delivering that, he delivered 5 dump truck loads to our community gardens. And he didn't charge us a delivery fee. And then he delivered a dump truck load to me. And on the way to me, it broke down. And he had to have it towed. And he called me out of the movie night last week because I'd offered to take him home if he needed it. When I got there to where he was, he said it just ran out of gas. It was a new to him truck, and the gas gauge didn't work, and he didn't know it. And so when I shared that story at the early service and how Pete had said, I've turned my life over to the Lord, and I want to serve him, and I'm trying to get things right in my life, and now this happens, and he was just really struggling. Somebody in the first service wrote a $120 check to pay his towing fee, and I put gas in his vehicle to cover the delivery expenses delivery fees he wasn't charging us. And so I sent him a check last week for that $120 from the church, from whoever it was that gave it. And he called me this week on Wednesday after he'd gotten the check, and he called me on all of my phones, not just one. He called me on all of my phones and left a message. And each time his voice broke as he was thanking this congregation for the way we generously share the love of Christ, and how touched he was, and what an impact that made in his life. You see, brothers and sisters, when we stake our claim on Jesus, when we make a commitment to allow him to lead us, it changes our lives, and it changes the lives of those who are around us. And all of that and so much more happens. That's just a week. That's just in a week of our life. So today, I want to ask you, who is Jesus to you? And I want you to wrestle with that question. And I'm not pushing you to go where you're not comfortable, but I want all of you to think about that question. Who is Jesus to you? What would your response be if that question were asked of you? Because, in the end, it really doesn't matter what Gary's response is to that if that question's being asked of me. I mean, it matters what Gary's response is for Gary, but it doesn't matter what Gary's response is for me. It doesn't matter what Kelly's response is for me. It matters what Kelly's response is for Kelly. And so What is your response to that question? It doesn't matter what my response is to that question for you. I mean, yes, I'm up here telling you about Jesus all the time, and I hope you're seeing Jesus in the way I live my life. But it doesn't matter how I answer that question. What matters is how you answer that question. So who is Jesus to you? And then the next question is, what do we do with that? And that's where Jesus goes next in this passage, which I don't think happened the same time, because if you pay attention to the way Luke wrote this, he's with just the disciples when he asks, who do others say I am and who do you say I am? And then later he turns to the crowd and says this next teaching. But it's significant that Luke puts them together here. Following Peter's declaration, where Peter said, you are the Messiah sent from God. That was Peter's response. Luke tells us that Jesus warned his disciples not to tell anyone who he was. Now hang on to that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And he goes on, and Jesus says, the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things. He said, he will be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He will be killed, but on the third day he will be raised from the dead. Then he said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross daily, and follow me. And so what Jesus is doing there, he's just asked his disciples, who do you say I am? And he's saying it's not enough to just stake that claim. You got to do something with him. It's not enough, brothers and sisters. And one of the reasons I'm words matter, and I'm really critical. I don't like it when we call ourselves believers. Because you and I both know a whole bunch of people that are believers, that believe in Jesus or that wear the label or wear the t-shirt. But when you look at the way they live their lives, you don't see Jesus. And I'm not being judgmental. I'm just being honest. And sometimes you don't see Jesus in me. And that's the nice thing about grace and forgiveness. We all can have grace and forgiveness extended to us, and none of us deserve it. But it is given to us as a gift from God. And so it's not enough to just say who Jesus is. We got to do something with that. And that's where he's going next. You know, and that's part of why I think he says, don't tell anyone. You know, don't tell people that you're a Christian. Show them. Live it. Because being a follower of Jesus is not about being a believer. It's not about staking a claim and saying, I've staked a claim. I'm a Christian. It's about letting people see it in the way you live your life. It's about a lifestyle. So I think Jesus was telling us, don't tell anyone, because he wanted us to live it. He wanted us to live who he was in our lives. So who is Jesus to you, and what will you do with him? Jesus says three things in this next little passage here. He says, first, you got to turn from your selfish ways. In other words, it's not all about you. It's not all about me. When we agree, when we stake a claim and say Jesus is our leader, it's about following his lead. And sometimes we go places that we don't want to go. I've gone a whole lot of places with Jesus I don't want to go. To the ministry was one of them. And here, 27 years later, here I still am. Maybe some of you would say, well, you shouldn't be. You shouldn't have never been. I don't know, but it just, you go down these roads and you do things with Jesus that you don't want to do or expect to do. But because you've staked a claim and Jesus is your leader, you do it. And you're enriched by it. So he says, turn from your selfish ways. It's not about you. And then he says, take up your cross daily. He didn't say take up your cross weekly. It's not just an hour a week. It's about a lifestyle. It's about every day. It's about 24/7, 365. It's about every moment of every day living for Jesus. And by taking up our cross, I think he's talking about sacrifice. Make sacrifices. I made a heck of a lot of sacrifices for Jesus, and I'm darn glad I did. And none of them were to the level of the sacrifices he made for me. When Sharon and I came here in 1999, we took a $17,000 a year pay cut to come, and we bought a house. And I wouldn't have changed it for a moment. And God's provided everything we needed and more. So he says, turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross daily. And then thirdly, he says, follow. He doesn't say believe, he says follow. In other words, serve. Do things. Do something with him. And so the question is, how will you use Jesus to engage the world? How will you allow Jesus to live in you and through you to engage the world? This week I was given 3 opportunities, distinct opportunities in the world to tell the beautiful story of our garden and the way God works in our lives. On Tuesday night, I missed 5Q because I was invited to come to the Parkside Parent or Public Advisory Committee. I always PAC committee, they called it. When I hear that, I think Political Action Committee, because that's and it wasn't. It was a Public Advisory Committee. And so there were about 30 people, 25, 30 people around this table. And we had dinner together, and we got to talk about a proposal to grow vegetables for service in the cafeteria. Now, it's interesting where they placed me. I was sat right at the head of the table where this chair is back next to the guy in the brown shirt. That was my seat. At the end of the night, I got to stand up and do a little introduction and share about this journey that we've been on to try to grow vegetables for the cafeteria. And I'll tell you about what I shared, because I shared the same thing 3 times this week, actually 4 times. Then the next day, or on Thursday, I had a busload of Salisbury University education and environmental students come to the garden. And I had an hour with them, and they were all female, and that just blew me away that all these females, they're all studying education. I don't know where the guys are, but guys, we need some of you in the classroom. Serious. We need some male teachers in the classroom. But anyhow, I got to share with them for an hour about our story. And then Thursday evening at Salisbury University in the Honors House, I had about 20 students that were there that I got to share again the story of the garden and the story of Community of Joy and the story of the Corner Church Collective. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And then on Wednesday, next one, I drove 7.5 hours round trip to be in an hour and 15-minute meeting with our top denominational executive, David Steele, who's standing in this picture, who I went to seminary with, who's a good friend of mine, who was just trying to gather some information about vision for the church from the church. And he had 3 of these meetings in our district, and they were all 3 about the same distance away. This was the only daytime option. That's why I went. It was at a nursing home. And so everybody there was, there were only 2 other people younger than me at that gathering. And so I got to share a little bit about your story. But in the 3 gatherings here, I shared the same exact story. In that gathering, I shared a little different. Because I didn't have as long a time to tell the story. I was responding to his questions, but I made sure I got some of it in. In the 3 gatherings, this is what I did. I began the story of the Camden Community Garden with what happens when we bought this building in 2008, and it had pews in here, and we ripped them out so that we could use chairs, so that we could turn this into a shelter for homeless men, and how that propelled us to need to go next door because we don't have a kitchen or a fellowship hall here, and how that got us to go next door to Bethany Lutheran to ask them to use their kitchen and fellowship hall, and that began a connection between a Missouri Synod Lutheran church and a Church of the Brethren congregation, and then how when they use their building or allow Seventh-day Adventist church to use their building on Saturdays, they joined us in the homeless shelter. And I said, when you got the Missouri Synod Lutheran and the Seventh-day Adventist, you got 2 ends of the spectrum Pilgrim here, and you got us in the middle of Church of the Brethren. And then when the Cooperative Baptists, the Restoration Project, joined them on Sunday nights and started using their facility, you have 4 very different churches that are working together. And I was sharing that story and sharing the beauty of it, and sharing how when we formed the Corner Church Collective to then expand and do our garden work, someone said, let's write down our beliefs. And I said, no, we can't write down our beliefs, because as soon as we write something down and you don't believe it, then we're at odds. And so when we work together in the Corner Church Collective, it's just Jesus, period. I don't care that they meet on Saturdays. I don't care that they like Revelation. I mean, they love Revelation, the Seventh-day Adventists. They love Revelation, and they love Daniel. I don't think I've ever preached out of well, yes, I did one time. But, and I hardly ever preach out of Revelation, but I love Jesus, and they love Jesus, and that's all that matters when we're together. And so I got to share that story in public, in a public school, and in a university just down the street, and in the garden with some university students. And I got to share that the reason that I wanted to do a garden was to push you guys outside of this building to engage in ways to bless our community. It's amazing the places Jesus takes you when you make that stake. And then after our denominational meeting on Wednesday, the denominational general secretary, Dave, my friend, said, I'm going to come visit you. I want to learn more. And then his assistant who was there hit me in the door and said, I've been looking at your church website. I said, well, good. Look at the garden website. And I gave her a garden card. Look at that too, because you got to see that. It's on the church website, and you can get there you can get either place. And I said, look at that. And she said, I'm coming to visit you too. And I said, well, Dave said he was coming. She said, I'll be there before he is. And then this week I got an invitation from a friend of mine who's been the denominational person that's been funding our garden ministries. He said they're doing a Church of the Brethren mission conference in Frederick in 2018. And he said to me, would you consider being a plenary speaker? One of the main session speakers about the work you're doing in the garden and engaging your community? I said, sure. He said, good, because I'm going to push them really hard to think about local missions as well as global missions in this mission conference. And then you already know a couple weeks ago, back when we were doing the shelter, the dean of students at the seminary I went to, Bethany Theological Seminary, came to visit. She came because she was in town, and in town was Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She came down just to see us and see what we're doing because she was that close, 4 hours away. And she had to go back. And she wanted, then after that day, she told me she wanted to do, she's also head of alumni relations, and she wanted to do a poster featuring some alumni on a rotating basis. And she said, I want you to be the first one. That's why I had those really nice pictures done that you've seen on Facebook. And she shared it with me this week, the poster, and she's going to send a copy once they get my name spelled correctly. They had an extra N in it, Hutchins' son. And she said, oh my, I already ordered them. She said, that's okay, I'll order them again. I said, thanks, because I've been working hard all these years to clean that up. It's Hutch's son, not Hutchins' son. And so that'll be featured at the seminary. It'll be featured at our annual conference this summer, which I'm going to, because I've been asked to do an insight session for an hour to talk about the garden with anybody who wants to hear about community gardenings and a way churches can engage their community. You see, when you stake your claim on Jesus, you never know where it's going to lead you, but you always know who's going to be with you in that journey. All this stuff that we do and all this stuff that we've done wouldn't be possible if Jesus weren't with us, providing for us and guiding us and leading us. But it is incredibly possible when He is with us and because He is with us. It just is an incredible journey when you make that commitment to Jesus to be your leader and Lord. But that journey isn't always rosy. And I don't want you to be mistaken or misled. I think a lot of pastors mislead people, and that's why they get turned off by Jesus. They say, once you sign on with Jesus, it's all going to be wonderful. Your whole life's changed and everything's hunky-dory. Well, it ain't. It ain't. My life hasn't always been rosy, and neither has yours. But here's the deal. Ever since that day in 1976 when I drove that stake in the ground and I made a claim and I allowed Jesus to be my leader and Lord, my forgiver, my companion, I've had a companion for the journey. Everywhere I've gone, Jesus has been there. In the tough times, He's sustained me. He's given me the strength. He's given me peace. He's been my source of comfort. I can't imagine what my life would have been like without Him. It's been the best decision I've ever made, and it'll be the best decision you ever make if you haven't made it. And so I want to end this morning, brothers and sisters, before we go to our talk back time with these questions. Who is Jesus to you? And what will you do with your answer to that question? And it can't simply be believe in Him. That's not enough. So if you haven't driven that stake yet, if you don't know who Jesus is and you want to drive that stake in the ground today, I want you to see me after this service. I'm not going to make you walk down the aisle. I'm not going to embarrass you in any way, but I'll be standing by the door and you just say, hey, Pastor Martin, I want to drive that stake, and I'll be happy to pray with you. And now I've talked enough. I want to hear from you. What thoughts, stories, prods, pushes do you have that you want to say?